A heavy blanket of clouds hung low over St. Michael's Church, casting the whitewashed building in somber shadows that matched the grief etched across the faces of Vila Nova's residents. The entire village had gathered to bid farewell to Ana Oliveira, a beloved teacher whose sudden death at 42 had left the community reeling. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and freshly cut flowers, nature's own tribute to a life cut short. Father Miguel stood before the gathering, his weathered hands gripping the worn edges of his prayer book. At 63, he had presided over countless funerals, but this one felt different. Perhaps it was the way Anna's German shepherd, Duke, had refused to leave the church grounds since her body arrived, or the whispered conversations that fell silent whenever he approached. Something about this death nagged at him, like a splinter buried too deep to reach. "We gather here today," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed congregation, "to remember Ana Oliveira, whose light touched so many." A low whine interrupted his words. Duke, who had been lying quietly beside Anna's sister Maria, suddenly rose and approached the closed casket. The dog's nails clicked against the stone floor, the sound echoing off the church's vaulted ceiling. Several mourners shifted uncomfortably in their wooden pews as Duke began to circle the casket, his nose pressed close to the polished wood. Maria attempted to call him back with a whispered command, her face flushing with embarrassment, but Duke ignored her. His behavior grew more agitated with each pass around the casket, his whines becoming more insistent. Father Miguel tried to continue the service, raising his voice slightly, but found his attention drawn repeatedly to the dog's strange behavior. Anna's dedication to her students. He pressed on, watching as Duke's tail lowered and his ears flattened against his head. The dog was now pawing gently at the side of the casket, something Father Miguel had never seen in all his years of service. In the front pew, Anna's parents exchanged worried glances, while her brother Marco half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene. The morning light filtering through the stained glass windows cast shifting patterns across the scene, and Father Miguel found himself studying the dog more closely. Duke had been Anna's constant companion for 7 years, known throughout Vila Nova for his gentle demeanor and intelligence. He wasn't prone to disruption or attention-seeking behavior. Isabella Santos, who ran the village pharmacy, leaned forward to whisper something to her husband, her eyes never leaving Duke. Other mourners began to murmur amongst themselves, the solemn atmosphere of the funeral giving way to a current of unease. Father Miguel could feel the shift in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. He thought back to his last conversation with Ana just 3 weeks ago. She had seemed troubled, distracted during confession. When he'd asked if something was wrong, she'd hesitated before saying, "Sometimes, Father, the truth is a heavy burden." At the time, he'd offered the usual comforts, but now those words took on a different weight. Duke's whining grew more urgent, and he began to scratch at the base of the casket with greater intensity. The sound of his claws against wood filled the church, drowning out the whispered prayers and muffled sobs. Father Miguel found himself moving away from the pulpit, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Instinct, perhaps, or divine guidance. Marco finally stood, moving to retrieve Duke, but Father Miguel raised a hand to stop him. "Wait," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The congregation fell silent, watching as their priest approached the casket. Duke looked up at him with intelligent eyes, tail wagging slightly in recognition. Father Miguel had known Ana since she was a child, had watched her grow from a precocious girl into a dedicated teacher. Her death, reported as a heart attack, had seemed sudden for someone so young and healthy. As he stood beside her casket, with Duke pressing against his legs and whining softly, the first seeds of doubt took root in his mind. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly widow who kept the church records, spoke up from her seat near the back. "Father, perhaps," she began, then fell silent. But her meaning was clear in the way she gestured toward the casket. Others nodded in agreement, the collective unease finding voice in her suggestion. The proper thing would be to continue the service, to maintain the dignity of the occasion. But as Father Miguel stood there, with Duke's insistent whining filling his ears and the weight of the congregation's expectant gazes upon him, He felt something shift in his understanding of his duty as a shepherd to his flock. He looked at Anna's family. Her mother's tears, her father's rigid posture, Maria's nervous fingers twisting in her lap, and Marco's tense expression. They deserved the truth, whatever it might be. The entire village deserved the truth. With a silent prayer for guidance, Father Miguel reached for the casket's lid. The ancient hinges creaked as he began to lift it, the sound seeming to echo the groaning of his own conscience. Duke's tail began to wag faster, and the dog stood straighter, more alert. As the lid rose, Father Miguel became aware of several things at once. The sharp intake of breath from the congregation, the way Duke's whining changed to a low growl, and most distinctly, an odor that should not have been present in a properly prepared body. It was subtle, chemical, something that triggered warnings in the primitive part of his brain. The sight of Anna's peaceful face, carefully prepared by the mortician, offered no immediate answers. But as Father Miguel stood there, with Duke now pressing his nose against the casket's interior, he knew that this was only the beginning. The dog's behavior had opened a door that could not be closed, leading them all down a path that would uncover secrets long buried in the heart of Villanova. Looking up at his congregation, Father Miguel saw fear, confusion, and curiosity warring on their faces. He took a deep breath, thinking carefully about his next words. Whatever mystery Duke had detected would need to be investigated, but first he had to maintain the dignity of this moment, this farewell to a woman who had meant so much to so many. "My friends," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I believe we must pause our service briefly." He turned to Anna's family, seeing the questions in their eyes. "With your permission, I would like to look into some concerns that have been raised." Marco stood, his face pale but determined. "Whatever Duke has sensed, Father, we need to know." Anna would have wanted the truth. His words seemed to break a dam, and suddenly others were nodding, speaking up in agreement. As the morning light strengthened outside, casting long shadows through the stained glass, Father Miguel realized that this funeral had become something else entirely, the beginning of a search for truth that would shake their small village to its foundations. And somehow, he knew that Duke's behavior was more than just a dog's grief for his owner. It was a warning, a message from beyond that demanded to be heard. The congregation waited, breaths held, as Father Miguel prepared to take the first step into what would become the most challenging investigation of his life. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, as if heaven itself was acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The silence in St. Michael's Church had transformed from respectful to electric, charged with anticipation as Father Miguel approached Duke. The German shepherd's attention remained fixed on Anna's casket, his powerful nose twitching as he continued to detect something that eluded human senses. The morning light had strengthened, throwing sharp-edged shadows across the stone floor and illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like restless spirits. Father Miguel knelt beside Duke, his joints protesting the movement with a familiar creak. Up close, he could see the dog's muscles were tense, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by an alertness that spoke of urgent purpose. The priest ran a weathered hand along Duke's back, feeling the slight tremors running through the animal's body. "What is it, boy?" he whispered more to himself than the dog. "What are you trying to tell us?" From the front pew, Maria leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Father, Duke has always been sensitive to things. Anna used to say he knew things before they happened." She twisted the black handkerchief in her hands, a nervous habit Father Miguel had noticed during the service. "The night before Anna, before we found her, he wouldn't stop barking at her door. We thought he was just being difficult." The priest nodded slowly, processing this information as he studied the casket more carefully. The polished wood gleamed in the morning light, but something about the craftsmanship caught his eye. The hinges seemed newer than the rest of the hardware, their brass finish lacking the patina of age he would have expected. Isabella Santos, the pharmacist, had moved closer, her professional interest evident in her furrowed brow. "Father," she began hesitantly, "I don't mean to overstep, but there's something about the smell." She glanced apologetically at Anna's family. "It's not quite right for someone who—" She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. The murmuring among the congregation grew louder, and Father Miguel could feel the situation slipping toward chaos. He stood, raising his hands for silence, years of authority in the gesture. "My friends, please. We must maintain our respect for Ana and her family while we address these concerns." Marco Oliveira stepped forward, his face set with determination despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Father Miguel is right, but we also need to understand what's happening here. Ana deserves that much." He turned to his parents, seeking their approval. His father, João Oliveira, nodded slowly, while his mother pressed her face into her handkerchief, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Father Miguel turned to Dr. Santos, who had been sitting quietly in the third row. "Doctor, would you be willing to perform an examination? Given the circumstances, I believe it would be appropriate." The elderly doctor rose, straightening his tie with practiced dignity. "Of course, Father. Though I must say, I signed the death certificate myself. Heart failure, as we discussed." A shadow of doubt crossed his face. But perhaps a closer look would be prudent. As the doctor approached the casket, Duke's behavior changed again. The dog moved to stand between the casket and the approaching physician, his hackles rising slightly. It wasn't aggressive, exactly, but there was a clear message in his stance. "Remarkable," Dr. Santos muttered, watching the dog. "In all my years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this." Father Miguel felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warming air in the church. He thought again of his last conversation with Ana, of the worry that had lined her face as she spoke of burdens and truth. At the time, he had attributed her anxiety to the normal stresses of teaching, perhaps some personal matter she wasn't ready to discuss. Now, those words seemed heavy with foreboding. Isabella stepped closer to the casket, her professional training overcoming her hesitation. "There's something else, Father. The mortuary. They usually use Anderson's in the city, but for Ana, they used that new place in Meadowbrook. No one could tell me why the change." This detail struck Father Miguel as significant, though he couldn't immediately say why. Meadowbrook was further away, and Anderson's had served their community for generati. Ons. Why would anyone choose to transport Anna's body the extra distance? The morning had grown warmer, but the atmosphere in the church remained charged with tension. Duke had resumed his inspection of the casket, moving methodically along its length, his nose working continuously. The dog's behavior seemed almost systematic now, as if he were searching for something specific. Father Miguel made a decision. "We need to contact the authorities," he said quietly, but his voice carried in the hushed church. "Something is not right here, and we owe it to Ana to understand what that might be." Marco pulled out his phone, then looked up apologetically, remembering where he was. Father Miguel nodded his permission. Some rules could be bent when circumstances demanded it. As Marco stepped outside to make the call, Mrs. Rodriguez approached Father Miguel, her aged face creased with concern. "Father," she whispered, "there's something you should know. The night before Ana died, I saw her here at the church. She was in the records room very late. When I asked what she needed, she said she was researching old donation records for a school project. But her hands were shaking when she left." This new piece of information sent Father Miguel's thoughts spinning in a new direction. The records room contained documents dating back to the church's founding, including financial records, correspondence, and official church business. What could Anna have been looking for? Duke had moved to the front of the church, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail toward the altar. Father Miguel watched as the dog's path led directly to the small door that connected to the church offices and the records room. The connection was too strong to ignore. Isabella had begun taking notes in a small notebook she pulled from her purse, her pharmacist training evident in her methodical approach. "Father," she said, looking up, "I think we should document everything. If there's an investigation." She was interrupted by Marco's return, his face pale but composed. "The police are on their way," he announced. "They're sending someone from the Special Investigations Unit in the city. They said," he swallowed hard, "they said not to touch anything else until they arrive." The congregation stirred at this news, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. This was no longer just a funeral. It was becoming an investigation, and their beloved Anna was at the center of it. Father Miguel looked at Duke, who had returned to the casket and was now sitting beside it, alert and watchful. The dog's initial frantic behavior had given way to something more purposeful, as if he knew his message had finally been received and understood. The priest moved to address his congregation, knowing he needed to maintain order while they waited for the authorities. But before he could speak, a sharp crack of thunder made everyone jump. The storm that had been threatening all morning was finally breaking, and fat drops of rain began to drum against the church's stained glass windows. As if on cue, Duke lifted his head and howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the church's vaulted ceiling. The sound sent shivers through the assembled mourners, but to Father Miguel, it seemed less like a cry of grief and more like a call to action. Standing there, watching the rain begin to sheet down the windows and listening to the last echoes of Duke's howl fade away, Father Miguel felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders. Whatever Anna had discovered in those church records, whatever had led to this moment, he was now part of it, and he would see it through wherever it led. The arrival of Detective Sarah Chun from the Special Investigations Unit brought a new energy to the subdued atmosphere of St. Michael's Church. Rain continued to drum against the windows as she moved efficiently through the space, her dark suit a stark contrast to the morning sea. Lothies of the congregation. Duke watched her intently, but made no move to interfere with her investigation. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Detective Chen requested, her notebook already open as she addressed Father Miguel. The priest recounted the morning's events, watching as she documented each detail with quick, precise strokes of her pen. When he mentioned Anna's last visit to the records room, her hand paused briefly before continuing to write. "And you say she was researching donation records?" Detective Chen asked, her dark eyes sharp with interest. "Did she specify what period she was looking into?" Father Miguel shook his head. "Mrs. Rodriguez only saw her in the records room. We don't know exactly what she was searching for." He glanced at Duke, who had moved to sit near the door to the church offices. "But I believe we should look there first." The detective nodded, then turned to address the congregation. "I need to ask everyone to remain here for now. We'll need statements from all of you." She gestured to two uniformed officers who had arrived with her. "Officers Peters and Rodriguez will help coordinate that process." As the police began organizing the witnesses, Father Miguel led Detective Chun and Marco toward the records room, with Duke padding silently alongside them. The dog's behavior had changed again. Gone was the frantic energy from earlier, replaced by a focused alertness that seemed almost professional. The records room was small, its walls lined with metal filing cabinets and wooden shelves packed with leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish, familiar and comforting to Father Miguel after so many years. But now, seeing it through new eyes, he noticed details he'd overlooked before. "Someone's been here recently," Detective Chin said, pointing to scuff marks on the floor near one of the filing cabinets. "These marks are fresh. The polish has been scraped away." She pulled on latex gloves and carefully opened the cabinet drawer. Which section would have the donation records? Father Miguel moved to help her, but Duke was already in motion. The German Shepherd went directly to a cabinet on the opposite wall, pawing gently at the bottom drawer. Marco let out a soft exclamation of surprise.